the dim light of Boston University's medical archives, Dr. Eleanor Mitchell adjusted her glasses as she carefully examined a collection of historical photographs donated by Massachusetts General Hospital. Most were clinical in nature: patients and medical staff, diagnostic images, treatment documentation. But one particular photograph caught her attention: a mother tenderly embracing her young son, dated June 1940. Unlike the sterile medical documentation surrounding it, this image captured a moment of genuine maternal love. "Professor Reed, you should look at this," she called to her colleague, Dr. Thomas Reed, a specialist in medical photography from the early 20th century. As Thomas approached, Eleanor pointed to a subtle anomaly visible near the boy's temple, a slight shadow that seemed inconsistent with the lighting in the rest of the photograph. "That's not a photographic artifact," Thomas said, reaching for his magnifying glass. "And look at the mother's expression. There's worry beneath that smile." Eleanor checked the catalog information. Catherine Miller and son James, age 7. Boston, Massachusetts, 1940. The caption noted it was taken at a free public health screening event. "The photographer must have captured something unintentional," Thomas murmured. "Something in the boy's skull structure that wasn't visible to the naked eye." Eleanor felt a chill. "We need to digitize this immediately. Whatever this shadow indicates, it might explain why this family photo was kept in medical archives rather than returned to the family." What began as research into historical medical practices was about to become something far more profound: the accidental discovery of a condition that would change medical understanding and a mother's desperate search for answers. The digital lab hummed with quiet efficiency as Dr. Karen Wong, head of the university's medical imaging department, manipulated the high-resolution scan of the photograph. The three academics huddled around her monitor, watching as the image of Catherine and James Miller transformed under Karen's expert handling. "I've enhanced the contrast and applied several filtering algorithms," Karen explained, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. "If there's any anatomical anomaly present, we should be able to see it more clearly now." The screen refreshed, and they collectively drew in a breath. What had appeared as a subtle shadow now emerged with unmistakable clarity: an abnormal mass within the boy's skull, positioned in the temporal lobe region. "That's definitely a tumor," Dr. Reed confirmed, his medical training immediately recognizing the shape. "And a substantial one, given its visibility even in this basic photograph." Eleanor felt her heart sink. A brain tumor in 1940. The prognosis would have been grim. "What's remarkable is that it's visible at all in this type of photograph," Karen said. "The angle of light must have been perfect, creating just enough shadow through the thin bone of a child's skull to render it visible on film." Thomas frowned, thinking, this might be the earliest accidental photographic detection of a brain tumor ever recorded. Before CAT scans, before MRIs. "We need to find out what happened to James Miller," Eleanor said, already making notes. "And why this photograph was preserved in medical archives. Was this tumor ever diagnosed? Was it treated?" The innocent family portrait had suddenly become a historical medical document of profound significance, capturing a moment when a mother's love and a photographer's flash accidentally revealed what medical science of the era could not yet properly see. The following morning, Eleanor and Thomas sat in the archives of Massachusetts General Hospital, poring over patient records from 1940. The archivist had been reluctant at first, but the potential historical significance of their discovery had eventually granted them limited access. "Here," Thomas said after 2 hours of searching. "James Miller, admitted July 18, 1940. That's just 6 weeks after the photograph was taken." Eleanor leaned over to read the faded handwriting. 7-year-old male presenting with persistent headaches, intermittent vision disturbances, and episodes of disorientation. Mother reports symptoms began approximately 3 months prior to admission. Thomas turned the page, revealing more detailed notes. The attending physician initially diagnosed James with migraines and possible epilepsy. No neurological examination was performed. They continued reading, tracking James's journey through the medical system. After 3 hospital visits with worsening symptoms, a neurologist finally examined him in August. The doctor noted possible intracranial pressure, but lacked the tools to confirm it. "Look at this." Eleanor pointed to a note dated September 1940. Catherine Miller brought the photograph to Dr. Harold Simmons, insisting the shadow near her son's temple was significant. The note says, "Mother's hysteria noted, reassurance provided." Thomas's expression darkened. They dismissed her concerns as maternal overreaction. But she was right, Eleanor whispered. She saw something in that photograph that the doctors missed or couldn't confirm with their available technology. The final entry for James at Massachusetts General was dated October 3, 1940. Patient transferred to Johns Hopkins Hospital at family's request. Eleanor and Thomas exchanged determined looks. Their search would need to continue in Baltimore, where they might discover whether Catherine Miller's desperate interpretation of a shadow in a photograph had ultimately saved her son's life. The Johns Hopkins Hospital archives were more extensive and better preserved than those in Boston. With special permission from the hospital's historical committee, Eleanor and Thomas found themselves examining the records of Dr. Walter Dandy, one of the world's first brain surgeons and a pioneer in the diagnosis and treatment of brain tumors. "This is extraordinary," Thomas whispered, carefully turning the pages of Dandy's case files from October 1940. Dr. Dandy actually references the photograph in his notes. Eleanor read aloud. Mrs. Miller presented unusual photographic evidence, suggesting a mass in the left temporal region. While unconventional, the shadow's position correlates with the patient's symptoms. Ventriculography scheduled to confirm diagnosis. Ventriculography was Dandy's innovation, Thomas explained. He injected air into the brain's ventricles to create contrast for X-rays, primitive but revolutionary for its time. The next pages contained the results. Dr. Dandy had confirmed a sizable tumor in exactly the location the photograph had suggested. His surgical notes were meticulously detailed, describing a high-risk procedure performed on October 17, 1940. He actually did it, Eleanor marveled. He operated based partly on a mother's insistence about a shadow in a photograph. The surgical outcome was guarded but promising. Tumor successfully resected, patient stabilized, prognosis uncertain due to the advanced state of the growth. What struck them both was a personal note Dandy had added. The photograph Mrs. Miller carried across state lines, insisting it showed her son's affliction, may have saved the boy's life. While medical professionals in Boston dismissed her interpretation as maternal hysteria, her persistence led to timely intervention. The photograph has been preserved for teaching purposes. Dr. Dandy had recognized what others had missed, not just a tumor, but the remarkable insight of a mother desperate to save her child. Eleanor and Thomas returned to Boston with copies of Dr. Dandy's records. But a crucial question remained unanswered. What had happened to James Miller after his surgery? Had he survived? Had the tumor returned? The Johns Hopkins records showed only his immediate post-operative care and discharge 3 weeks after surgery. "We need to find public records," Eleanor suggested. "Birth certificates, death records, census data, anything that might tell us what became of James and his mother." Their search led them to the Massachusetts State Archives, where they meticulously combed through decades of records. Finally, a promising lead emerged. A James H. Miller, with the correct birth year, appeared in Boston city directories throughout the 1950s and 60s. "Look at his occupation," Thomas said, pointing to an entry from 1962. "Radiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, the very hospital that dismissed his mother's concerns." Eleanor sat back, stunned. He became a medical imaging specialist. Further research confirmed it was indeed the same James Miller. They found his medical school graduation photo, his marriage certificate, and eventually an obituary from 2011 that filled in the remaining blanks. After surviving his brain tumor surgery in 1940, James had experienced a difficult recovery but eventually thrived. Inspired by Dr. Dandy and driven by his own experience, he had pursued medicine, specializing in the emerging field of diagnostic radiology. His career had focused on early detection techniques, and he had pioneered several improvements in X-ray technology during the 1960s and 70s. His mother's interpretation of a simple photograph changed not only his life, but potentially countless others through his subsequent work. Eleanor said quietly, "We need to find out if Catherine Miller is still alive," Thomas suggested. "She'd be well over 100 now, but it's not impossible." Their search for answers had become a search for Catherine herself, the mother whose desperate insight had altered medical history. After exhaustive searching, Eleanor and Thomas located not Catherine Miller, who had passed away in 1983, but her granddaughter, Dr. Rebecca Miller, a neurologist practicing in Chicago. After several emails explaining their research, she agreed to meet them. Rebecca greeted them in her office at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, a tall woman in her 60s with a striking resemblance to the mother in the photograph. "I grew up hearing the story," she explained, gesturing them to sit. "It's become something of a family legend. How my grandmother saved my father's life by refusing to accept what doctors told her." "Do you have any personal items from that time?" Eleanor asked hopefully. "Letters, journals, anything that might shed light on how your grandmother interpreted the photograph?" Rebecca smiled. "I have something better." She unlocked a cabinet and carefully removed an old leather journal. This was my grandmother's diary from 1940 to 1941. She documented everything about my father's illness. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged excited glances as Rebecca opened the journal. Catherine's handwriting filled the pages, detailing her growing concern about her son's symptoms, the dismissal she faced from multiple doctors, and her moment of realization when seeing the developed photograph. June 10, 1940, Rebecca read aloud. "Collected James's health fair photograph today. Something strange caught my eye. A shadow near his temple that seems to match where he rubs his head during his episodes. The doctors insist it's nothing, but I can see it plain as day. How can they not see it too?" The journal chronicled Catherine's increasingly desperate journey, borrowing money for train tickets to Baltimore, convincing Dr. Dandy to examine both her son and the photograph, and her agonizing wait during James's surgery. "My grandmother wasn't a medical professional," Rebecca said quietly. "She was just a mother who knew something was wrong with her child and refused to stop fighting until someone listened." Back at Boston University, Eleanor and Thomas organized their findings with growing excitement. What had begun as historical research had evolved into something with potential contemporary relevance. Catherine Miller inadvertently discovered a primitive form of transillumination diagnosis, Thomas explained to their department colleagues at a special meeting. The photograph was taken at sunset, with strong lateral light striking James's skull at precisely the right angle to create a shadow of the mass inside. Eleanor continued the presentation, showing slides of the original photograph alongside modern imaging techniques. What's remarkable is that Catherine recognized the significance of this shadow without any medical training. She intuitively understood that this abnormality in the photograph represented the cause of her son's symptoms. Dr. Wong, who had helped enhance the original image, joined the discussion. "I've been experimenting with recreating these conditions using modern photographic equipment on medical dummies with simulated tumors. Under very specific lighting conditions, similar shadows can indeed be produced, particularly in children whose skulls are thinner." "Are you suggesting this could have practical applications today?" asked the department chair skeptically. "Not as a diagnostic tool for developed nations," Thomas clarified, "but in remote areas without access to modern medical imaging equipment, a modified version of this technique might serve as an initial screening method for certain types of brain masses in pediatric patients." Eleanor displayed the final slide, a page from James Miller's own research papers from 1972, where he had proposed using calibrated light sources for preliminary neurological screening in underserved regions. James himself tried to develop this concept, Eleanor explained. He never forgot how a simple photograph had saved his life, and he spent years trying to transform his mother's intuitive discovery into a systematic approach that could help others. The room fell silent as the full implication became clear. They had uncovered not just a historical curiosity, but potentially the foundation for a life-saving technique for the developing world. 6 months later, Eleanor and Thomas stood nervously, at the entrance to the medical conference hall in Boston, where attendees were gathering for the presentation of their paper. Accidental Discovery, the 1940 Miller photograph and its implications for low-resource neurological screening. Their research had expanded significantly. Working with Dr. Wong and a team of medical imaging specialists, they had refined what they now called the Miller method, a technique using calibrated light sources and digital photography to detect certain brain abnormalities in children without access to advanced imaging equipment. "I still can't believe we're here," Eleanor whispered. "From a historical photograph to a peer-reviewed medical paper, initial tests in university laboratories had shown promising results. The technique could detect simulated masses of certain sizes and positions with surprising reliability. While not comparable to MRI or CT scans, the method required only a smartphone with a specialized app and an attachment that cost less than $20 to produce." Rebecca Miller joined them at the podium as a co-author, bringing both her neurological expertise and her family's perspective to the presentation. The audience of medical professionals listened with growing interest as they described how Catherine Miller's maternal intuition and desperate persistence had led to this moment. "What we're proposing isn't revolutionary," Thomas clarified during the presentation. "It's a stopgap screening tool for regions where children might otherwise receive no neurological assessment at all. A positive result would flag the need for further testing, potentially saving lives through earlier intervention." Questions from the audience were probing but respectful. Several doctors from international aid organizations expressed immediate interest in field testing the technique in rural clinics. As the session ended, an elderly radiologist approached them. "I trained under Dr. James Miller in the 1970s, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He often spoke of developing something exactly like this. He would be profoundly moved to see his mother's legacy finally realized." The University Gallery opened its doors to Shadows and Light: Medical Discovery Through a Mother's Eyes, featuring the photograph of Catherine and James Miller as its centerpiece. The exhibition traced the remarkable journey from a mother's desperate insight to a medical screening technique being implemented in clinics across the developing world. Enlarged prints revealed the subtle shadow that Catherine had noticed, alongside interactive displays demonstrating how the Miller method worked. Medical imaging throughout history was presented chronologically, with the 1940 photograph positioned as an accidental precursor to technologies that would not be developed for decades. Eleanor had worked closely with Rebecca Miller to ensure the human story remained central. Catherine's journal entries were featured prominently, bringing to life her struggle against the medical establishment's dismissal of her concerns. "My grandmother wasn't trying to be a medical pioneer," Rebecca's voice explained through the gallery headsets. "She was just fighting to save her son. But in doing so, she demonstrated something profound about the power of observation and persistence." The exhibition had drawn interest beyond academia. Medical students arrived in groups, learning about the importance of listening to patients and their families. Parents visited with their children, seeing in Catherine's story a reflection of their own fierce protectiveness. At the opening reception, Thomas found Eleanor standing before a photograph of James Miller as an adult, working as a radiologist in the 1960s. "His entire career was shaped by what happened to him as a child," Thomas observed. Eleanor nodded. "And now his story is shaping new careers, new approaches to medicine in places that need it most." The exhibition had transformed a personal family tragedy averted into a larger narrative about medical progress and the often unrecognized contributions of those outside the profession. 1 year later, Eleanor received an email with an attachment from a medical outreach team in rural Tanzania. The photograph showed a young boy, perhaps 5 years old, sitting on an examination table, his mother beside him with an arm around his shoulders. The accompanying message was brief but powerful. "First life saved using the Miller method. Shadow. Detected during routine screening. Child transported to regional hospital where MRI confirmed tumor. Surgery successful. Prognosis excellent due to early detection." Eleanor forwarded the email to Thomas and Rebecca, her hands shaking slightly. What had begun as historical research had come full circle. Another mother and son, another photograph revealing what might otherwise have remained hidden until too late. The Miller method was now being used in clinics across 17 countries, with training programs established in regions where advanced medical imaging remained inaccessible. A simple smartphone attachment, costing less than a day's wage in most developed nations, was providing crucial preliminary screening for thousands of children. Rebecca called Eleanor as soon as she received the email. "My father would have been 89 this year," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He spent his entire career trying to develop what you've helped create." "It was your grandmother's legacy," Eleanor reminded her gently. Catherine's refusal to accept what she was told when she knew something was wrong. In medical schools across the country, the story of Catherine and James Miller had been incorporated into curriculum, teaching future doctors about the importance of listening to patients and their families, and recognizing that expertise can take many forms. A photograph taken in 1940 had not only saved one child's life, but now, decades later, was saving others. A shadow revealing what might otherwise remain hidden. A mother's love and determination illuminating a path forward for medical science.